Welcome, everyone, to Asian Pacific Voices Radio, where you'll find stimulating conversations about stories and topics that affect our communities. I'm your host, Sasha Fu. Today, our guest is a chef and restaurant owner with a whole list of accolades to her name. Chef Cheetie Kumar is introducing new flavors and foods through her restaurant, Ajja, in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's inspired in part by her South Asian heritage in India. Cheetie Kumar draws on the wealth of fresh, locally sourced ingredients that are grown or produced in abundance in the North Carolina area. As a chef, she's been profiled by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. She's also been recognized as someone to watch in the culinary world with numerous James Beard Award nominations. And we are delighted to welcome Chef Cheetie Kumar to this episode of Asian Pacific Voices. Hey, Cheetie.
Hi, Sasha. So nice to be here.
Glad to have you. We start many of our podcasts by learning more about the family and your origins. And I'd like to learn a little bit more about your family in particular, and your roots. You were born in India.
Actually, I was born in Pittsburgh, but my parents were here. Yeah, they were here on a 5-year visa, and my mom chose to maybe not extend that visa, and then she got pregnant. And it was too late for her to change her mind. So I was 6 months old. We moved back to India. We lived in Chandigarh until I was 8.5. And Chandigarh is a city in Punjab. It's actually the capital. And then we moved from India to the Bronx when I was 8.5.
Okay. I am sorry about getting that mixed up. I remember that you did tell me that, and it was unusual because you made 2 cross-country transits, your family, when at an early age. And it was kind of traumatic for your mother in particular. I know that for many immigrant families, there's a sense of loss when they leave their home countries. How did your family maintain their ties to India and to their family, even when they were transplanted into a completely new environment? As you say, this was New York City.
Yeah, and it was, not like Manhattan or even Queens that has such a rich Asian population. We were in the Bronx that really didn't have much of a community from India. And when I was in the 4th grade and didn't really have any kids around me that talked like me, sounded like me. There were a lot of people of color, but there were, people from the Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic, and it was diverse. So in that sense, I didn't feel like the only non-white person in the classroom, but certainly I had, pretty thick accent, and I was very much, a little immigrant child. So there was definitely a feeling of displacement and discomfort, a lack of security. I think a lot of families have that experience of moving and not having their green card approved for 3 years. So for a long time, we didn't know if we could stay or not. It was particularly hard for my mother, who, I think she had suffered such a traumatic loss and change as a young girl because, her family, my maternal side, is all from Pakistan. Originally, we're Hindus that were Punjabi Pakistani. And when Pakistan was created, their whole family was forced to leave, and her parents were killed in that partition. So every time there was a major move, and my mom definitely endured many of those in her lifetime, I think she was very triggered by that experience. And then moving, at that point, when I was 8.5, my sister was almost 16, my brother was 5, we had a full-fledged family, and moving to a culture, and definitely they've planned on this being their permanent, home, being never going back to India if the visa was going to work out. She really navigated a lot of sort of existential problems. I think how to raise a family, how to raise 2 daughters, especially a teenage daughter and my sister, keeping the heritage, keeping the values that they value, but knowing that it was not realistic for us to live in a bubble and maintain, being like strict Indian, culturally insulated people. I mean, my mom, I remember her saying that I want you kids to be citizens of the world. I don't want you to feel like you're limited by conservative Indian values. And she was definitely forward thinking as far as like, you know, her daughters being strong, independent, self-reliant, not carrying the traditional cultural boundaries that India can sometimes represent. So I think with all that, food was such an anchor for our family, mostly because she really valued home cooking. We ate dinner, and she cooked dinner every night at home. We had a home cooked meal. Everybody sat at the table together. We might be fighting, it might be miserable, but we did it anyway. And I think for her, food was such a powerful tool of memory and connection because she never was able to go back to her childhood home. And she recognized that same similarity in her children now. And the thing that she carried through her whole life was these memories of food. She was always very food driven. And I think that's sort of the gene that got passed down to me.
Yeah, apparently it was passed down to you when you saw your mother cooking and possibly doing cooking techniques as a child. Did this leave an impression upon you? I'm sure at the conscious level you weren't thinking, "Oh, this is a way for me to keep preserving my ties to my Indian heritage." But at some level, now as an adult, you must look back on that and think, "I was kids are sponges; they absorb so much."
Yeah, I mean, I remember being, 4 or 5 in India and seeing like my grandmother boil milk and make parathas and, roll rotis and, all of the things. I was just always naturally drawn to the kitchen, and I would kind of like waffle between or just like shuttle myself between the kitchen and then the stereo. And I would just be sort of immersed in that world of music and the smells of the kitchen. And I knew when the milk was up, I could smell it. And my grandmother would be scraping the pot of like, the stuff that gets caramelized on the bottom, and she'd scrape it and put a little sugar and put it in my mouth. And, these are like very, now very like palpable sensory memories. And for whatever reason, I was the kid in the family that was just always very curious about what was being done in the kitchen. And my mom also just carrying all that trauma. I think she was also very emotionally, I knew at a very early age that she had suffered this loss. And for me, being connected to her emotionally was a way of protecting her from more heartbreak. And I really wanted to find any way that I could to make her feel not alone. And I think being with her in the kitchen and being interested in what she was making, maybe a subconscious way for me to get close to her and for her to feel like there was somebody in the world that really loved her unconditionally.
Oh, that's really beautiful. Food and cooking are these enduring bonds. And sometimes when language fails us, that's the vocabulary in which we express our love and affection. That's a beautiful story.
100%.
Well, your path from school and growing up in the United States to becoming a chef wasn't exactly a straight line.
No, I don't have many straight lines.
It wasn't exactly a straight line. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did before you became a chef and restaurant owner?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I went to college in Amherst, Massachusetts at the University of Massachusetts. I worked at the radio station more than I attended classes. I studied psychology, but I didn't want to be a clinical psychologist. I was always drawn to the whole, world of bands and live music, even though I wasn't really allowed to go to shows as a kid. Once I started, it was just like, man, it was I just loved the whole process of, that connection that bands have with their audience. And so I worked on the concert board, and I think I just really wanted to be a musician, but I didn't have the guts or the experience. I never was gifted the guitar that I always wanted as a kid. So I didn't really learn how to play until much later, but I figured that I could make a career out of management or some sort of behind the scenes thing. And that was a career that I could explain to my parents. Like, I'm not going to be a doctor. I'm not going to be a psychologist, but I'm going to do this business. And business is a word that they could kind of get behind because, maybe that meant security. And I did pretty well. I was 22. I started my own company and did that for a few years. And then all my bands broke up around the same time and I was left without a company. So I'd already met my now husband. And so we decided, he's like, you just want to play music. You don't want to manage these musicians. Play. Let's, start a band. So we started a band and bought an ex-prison van in the state auction lot and booked a tour and went on tour, and then we kind of stayed on tour with a couple of different bands for 10 years. And so I did that. And in the meantime, while I was touring, and it became such a relentless like a cycle, and I loved it, but it's also really hard, and it's hard to make a living as an independent musician. So I got a job in a restaurant. Initially I was just in the kitchen for about a year, but once we really started touring I needed to make more money. So I asked to bartend. So I bartended the whole time we were touring. So I'd come home from a 6-week tour and work 10 bar. They gave me my shifts back every time for some reason. And so I was kind of like living this duality. And while I was touring, I was dreaming about food and reading about food and studying food.
I want to jump in and ask you a little bit about how you went about educating yourself about food and cooking. You didn't have the privilege or advantages of perhaps having an immersive experience in one of these, fancy culinary institutes or working as the apprentice for some Michelin-starred chef. So you did a lot of due diligence on your own. Is that right?
I did. I educated myself. I read a lot of cookbooks from cover to cover, like there were novels, and I would, watch Great Chefs, Great Cities on PBS, and just like really, I was studying, and I would practice and try different recipes at home, and I would explore our local culinary sources. I'd go to the farmers market. One advantage that Raleigh has is we have a very big, old state sponsored farmers market that's open 363 and a half days a year. And it's not fancy. It's not like, organic or anything. It's just sort of like a heritage of agriculture that's very rich here. And so you can get anything seasonally. And so I've really learned about what grows when. And then there's a really diverse Asian population in this area too. So there's a lot of markets that are Chinese and Korean and Indian and Thai, and a guy from Laos owns one market. So I could get any kind of ingredient from any part of Asia that I wanted. And I just thought marrying those two was so interesting, and it really worked. And it made sense to me because my parents would go to the market in India. And in northern India, there are a lot of crossover. There's a lot of similarities. So the seasons, it's a little hotter there. Well, it used to be. Now it's hot everywhere. But, eggplant, okra, tomatoes, mustard greens, long beans. Like, it's like, oh my God, it's the same stuff. So to me, cooking in this part of North Carolina makes sense with the palate and the pantry that I grew up with. Versus say doing a Nordic restaurant would be odd here because it's not the right kind of climate for those ingredients. So it just was serendipity that it worked out that way. But I really, try to study all aspects of it, but nothing can really prepare you for the vast and deep learning experience of operating and running a kitchen in a professional restaurant. That's a lot.
We talk on this program a lot about breaking barriers. As a woman of color in the culinary world, did you feel you had to struggle for recognition and respect?
I, really did. But I think that, looking back, I can see that. But in the moment, I didn't really attribute those feelings of inferiority to my race or my gender so much. Like I kind of never thought about that until later. In the moment, I tend to internalize those feelings and think that it's about me, that I'm not good enough. And they, the imposter syndrome that everybody talks about now, a decade ago wasn't really a thing that was in the vernacular of the chef world. It wasn't, as accepted. I think the culture of the country has changed quite a bit in the last 3 to 5 years. But I think I just always felt so kind of inferior, or had shame, or I don't know, whatever it was left over from my experience as a child. But now looking back, I'm like, oh, that was just straight up misogyny and racism. But yeah, I mean, I felt like I had a disadvantage for a lot of other reasons. And now I'm like, oh yeah, the first two reasons were my gender and my race.
Well, it's interesting looking back. I guess, they say hindsight is 50-50.
2020.
And it's interesting when we look back on past experiences. This has happened to me, and I didn't interpret something as being racist or gender biased, but now I can see clearly that that's what it was. So it's interesting as we get older, our prisms, our lenses change. I want to ask you a little bit about the kind of food that you create at Ajja. We've heard this term fusion cuisine. I think it's bandied about a little bit too liberally because it applies to a lot of different kinds of food, in my experience. How would you describe the food that you cook at Ajja?
Ajja is only about a month old. Garland, was my restaurant that I had for 9 years. That was my 9.5 years. And that really got called fusion. And honestly, I feel like there's an inherent racism in that term in itself.
Okay.
I think when people draw on European influences, they're called inspired. They say Italian inspired, or like I cook, seasonally, I really, we're a farm to table restaurant with Italian inspiration. Nobody calls that an Italian fusion restaurant, right? I think a lot of chefs that have a perspective are cooking from a time and place, and the place is informed by where they live and where they're influenced by, or where they're from, or where their family of heritage is from. I think fusion is relegated to Asian people a lot of times because we're expected to carry the burden of authenticity and represent, our entire nation of where our parents are from. And we might have never lived there, but, if you happen to have that, 100% DNA heritage, you're like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to cook this way. And that in itself, I think, is such a limitation that is put upon by our people. And to me, the worst reviewers that we have are people from India. There's this weird expectation of limitation that we put on ourselves, that we put on our people. I look at chefs in India and they have a lot more creative freedom, and they don't get called fusion. They just get called innovative. And I think a lot of white chefs in this country can be influenced by Asian countries, and they don't get called fusion. They get called, innovative, or they have this broad vocabulary. So I kind of resent the word fusion because also to me, it's a pretty dated term, and to me it applies to a very specific blend of French and Japanese technique from the 90s or the 80s. Mm-hmm. And that's not what I do. I like to be inspired by connections of foodways that are influenced by people migrating voluntarily or involuntarily. I like the way spices have moved around the planet, and I like to find those commonalities between people, especially in certain parts of Asia. And that's what I'm inspired by. So long answer, but the F word.
I want to apologize because I don't want you to think that I am using fusion cuisine with respect to what you're cooking. I understand that the term is dated, and it's interesting that, I understand that the term is dated. And I think that you're right, that there is sort of a kind of Western centric aspect to using that term. Remember when I was a kid, there was, to check the box for race, there was white, black, and other. And to me, it's like fusion cuisine, sort of like, okay, you either cook Europe in the European tradition, or you're other. Because for a
Right,
while, I think that
exactly.
American palates didn't know, well, what's the difference between Thai or Indian or Chinese or, Jamaican. It's just other.
Yeah, it's curry, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, even now, I think, it's, yeah, Asia is such a vast, diverse place and certainly a lot bigger than Europe. But, Europe gets to have the specialties of each country. But Asia is a big blob in a lot of Western minds.
What do your parents and family members think of your success? In many, especially Asian, I think, immigrant families, success is defined kind of rigidly. At least it was for me. You're either a scientist or a doctor or a successful business person. You are a successful business person. Let me put that out there. But how do your parents see your success now?
Well, my parents, I think, thought that when I started a company as a band manager, initially they were like, "Well, okay, she's young enough to, still recover from this." But definitely, it was a tough sell for me to not go to grad school. I think they really were very uncomfortable with it. I think my dad, in particular, was not so thrilled about the prospect of like me not being a quote unquote professional. And then when I started playing music, I remember calling my mom from a payphone in Pensacola, Florida, and saying, "I love being on tour and this is what I want to
Oh,
do. I'm the happiest I've ever been." And she said, "Do it, go for it."
no.
And I think my mom was a lot more open to that idea and supportive. And even if she had doubts, once I became an adult, really tried to convey that she believed in me and that I could do whatever I wanted. I don't think she fully believed that. But once the restaurant opened, my mom only came one time in like the few months after we opened, and then she died 3 years later. Um, I think I don't really know how to answer that because I think that there's nothing that you can actually do to make your parents feel like you're successful in our community anyway. So I just focus on not um, needing external validation quite as much as I was raised to need it. But definitely, my parents didn't disown me, but they were also very worried for a long time. And um, it didn't help me find my path because I was always second guessing because I could always
Yes.
kind of feel their like hesitation about it. But after a certain time, you're like, well,
Yeah, this is my path. This is
yes.
what I've chosen, and screw the skepticism and the questions. This is what I'm going to do, and I'm glad you hewed to your path, Cheetie. Let's go back to the kitchen now. I'm curious about what are the inspirations for, besides having this plethora of wonderful fresh ingredients around you. What are the flavors that inspire you? What are the dishes that you like to explore, or the flavors you like to explore?
Well, with Ajja, after closing Garland, well, I was already kind of working on Ajja. Ajja is a very small. The inside of the building is only about 1,800 square feet, and more than half of that is taken up by the kitchen. The vast majority of our seating, well, most of our seating is outside, and it's a covered patio, and it's got this really nice view. It's kind of like somebody's really great backyard. And so the whole space kind of feels very Mediterranean, modern Mediterranean to me. And I was inspired by the space to create a menu that explored more narrowly the region of, Northwest India. And I mean, that's not a narrow region, but like the Levantine area. I wanted a lot of vegetable forward dishes that are, at Ajja at Garland we used, olive oil, coconut oil, grapeseed oil, peanut oil, sesame oil. Like just even if I focus on the oils, that kind of told the story of the palette of our cuisine. At Ajja, we only pretty much use olive oil and one neutral oil. So it's olive oil based. It's very bright. It's light. It feels good in the space to eat that way. We have really delicious homemade bread that's kind of Tunisian-ish inspired. I still like to stay away from the standards of menus that are, I'd never put butter chicken on my menu at Garland, and I'm not going to put hummus on my menu at Ajja. So I think that there's a diversity of dishes that people maybe aren't able to find on menus in this part of the country. So I love the inspiration of Persian, Indian, Afghani, Tunisian, Moroccan for Ajja. So that's where the inspiration comes from.
When you design the menus for Garland and Ajja, I imagine that they change by season. This may sound like a super silly question, but what's your favorite season?
No, it's not silly at all. Oh, I love the start of every season because things are new. So, I mean, it's really hard to compete with the dawn of spring when all of the green things come in, and asparagus and sugar snap peas and little baby root vegetables and overwintered carrots that are super sweet. The greens are great. I like having an all green menu, and that season doesn't last very long, so you really have to jump on it. And I love the feeling of grabbing that stuff and even only having it for maybe 3 to 6 weeks, depending on when our first big heat wave comes through here. I like the fleeting nature of that, and it happens before I can even get sick of it and it's gone. I kind of like that. But the beginning summer is great because I think there's 3 seasons in summer, and that transition to fall is also really fun. Winter is great too, but it's hard to change the menu very often when it's just cold.
Do you have a signature dish, so to speak, or are there customers who followed you and say, "Oh, I really like this dish that you had at Garland. I hope you have some sort of adaptation or some sort of variation on that at Ajja"?
Yeah, we had a cauliflower 65 that was sort of our big anchor. But right now, I'm just kind of resistant to signature dishes. I feel boxed in by it, and it's kind of we'll see if there's something that people really glom onto. But we're just finding our legs right now. But the cauliflower 65 will not be on this menu.
Cheetie's probably not going to say she has a signature dish because she doesn't want to be. And I was thinking boxed in. It was too rigid to say, "Oh yeah, I do this and that." Because you strike me as somebody who likes to keep evolving and changing.
Yeah, sometimes it's not a good business decision, but it's still can't.
We want cheeseburgers
any other way. Yeah, that's right.
I love to ask people who are involved with food, either growing food, producing food, making food, about food literacy. It strikes me that in this country especially, and in Western culture in general, that we are increasingly feeding ourselves with processed foods. And children, in fact, have a difficult time conceptually understanding where food comes from. And actually, milk comes from a cow, not a carton.
Box, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think you can do to help? What are your thoughts about our food literacy right now in the United States?
Well, I think that hopefully we've kind of reached the peak of processed food dependency. And I think the conversation about local, seasonal, organic, vegetable, plant-forward, plant-based diet is becoming a little bit more, common. I think that's a conversation that, every week, every day, there's probably an article out about all of the various reasons, the health of our bodies and the health of our planet, the health of our economy, relying on locally grown vegetables and eating that is good for all the way around. But I think education, our school system is definitely responsible for the establishment of that literacy. And sadly, food is not really a part of the American public school system. And before the pandemic, I did a lot of work with nonprofits that were trying to help support, school lunches and kids being able to just have food. I mean, North Carolina in itself is in the top 10 for child food insecurity, which is absolutely absurd to me because like we just got through talking about all the abundance of produce that we have here and what a rich agricultural heritage we have, and yet our children are not getting enough to eat. I mean, that, we could have an entire conversation about how broken on every level the systemic food system of our country is. And I don't know what the answer to it is, except that, again, I try to like really make non-meat based things, the majority of our menu, and like I'm limiting what we're doing with meat on our menu. And I really hope like as we grow this restaurant, Ajja is in a neighborhood, and I want, like some sort of community involvement that is about food literacy for children to be a part of what we do, whether it's on our property or us supporting, community farms and school gardens that are growing food. I mean, I just think that that's such an important part of moving our culture and our society forward. There's no way to have a healthy society without people understanding what to put in their bodies and how to eat.
Yeah, I love those ambitions for you and your restaurant. Not only are you feeding people, feeding their bellies, but you're also feeding their knowledge and their minds, and helping them understand that they can work towards a more sustainable planet and a healthier future.
Yeah, feeding their future bellies.
Yeah, their future bellies, the bellies of their future kids too.
That's right. That's right.
Do you have any words of it's like wisdom or counsel or guidance for other young people? Put yourself, I mean, you didn't, as I said, you didn't take a straight line from college to the kitchen, but other people who have a sense of where they might want to go, but they're unsure of themselves or not quite sure that the path they dream of taking is the one they should start pursuing because of all kinds of like either parental pressures or social pressures or just self-doubt. What are your words of wisdom or counsel to folks like that?
Well, I wish when I was younger, I didn't, there's which thought are you going to be guided by? Well, who's your boss? Is the doubt your boss, or is your ambition the boss? And I think the sooner that you can match your skills with your passion, dreams are great, but you actually have to do, and amassing knowledge and experience is a great way to squash those self-doubts. So don't wait, I think find the thing that puts a smile on your face, pay attention to the driving force, the things in your life that give you force and give you energy. And doubt is a negative emotion, and it's depleting. So don't pay attention to that, because you don't want to live a depleted life. You want to enrich your life, focus on the things that make you happy and recharge you, and learn as much as you possibly can. Get the skills under your belt. There's nothing like repetition to make you skilled at something. Get 10,000 hours of practice of whatever it is that you love to do. Get good at it, and you will succeed if you don't let doubt be your guiding principle.
I love your optimism. Thank you so much for your thoughts on this. If people want to follow you, the progress of your restaurant, or just find out what you've been up to, how do they do that?
Well, I'm on Instagram at Cheetie Ku, CheeTieku, and you can follow Ajja at Ajja Eats on Instagram, and our website is ajjaeats.com. I think we're on Facebook too, but I've never been on Facebook, so I'm not sure how it works. But Ajja Eats is our handle.
Okay, I think we'll find you through Ajja Eats. Thank you so much, Cheetie Kumar,
Yes.
our guest today on Asian Pacific Voices. We'd love to hear from you, our listeners, about any suggestions you might have for future shows, guests, or topics. And also be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast platform, as well as follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and on our Asian Pacific Voices YouTube channel. Asian Pacific Voices Radio is produced by Asian Culture and Media Alliance, ACMA, a nonprofit that empowers our Asian Pacific Islander communities with a voice through the media arts. If you would like to support our program, please visit AsianPacificVoicesRadio.com. I'm your host, Sasha Fu. Thanks for tuning in, and until then, take care.